Hello, everyone. My name is Josh Goldstein, and I'm a research fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. A decade ago, researchers were concerned about AI tools and how they could be used to undermine politics, elections, and national security. But many of the worst case scenarios that were envisioned, like a deep fake tipping an election or fake footage of a military leader inciting violence, did not come to pass. And then many deemed the risk to be overblown. Now we sit in a very different moment. Generative AI tools can create content that's difficult to distinguish. They're accessible to anybody with a smartphone, and ChatGPT is a household name. An Axios Morning Consult poll from August found that 53% of Americans said that misinformation spread by AI will impact who wins the election. And just last week, we saw how these tools could be used for voter suppression. Voters in New Hampshire received a robocall reportedly using an AI-generated version of President Biden's voice to tell people not to vote. So how much does AI change the threat landscape? Is the threat of AI-generated disinformation overblown, or is it severe? And how might AI tools be used to support democracy and to increase resilience against foreign interference? Today, we're joined by three leading experts to help address these questions. First, on my left is Renée DiResta. Renée is the research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory. She investigates the spread of malign narratives across social networks and assists policymakers in understanding and responding to these problems. She has advised Congress, the State Department, and other academic, civic, and business organizations, and has studied disinformation and computational propaganda in the context of pseudoscience conspiracies, terrorism, and other state-sponsored information warfare. Next, we have Kiril Avramov, an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies and a non-resident fellow of the Intelligence Studies Project at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also the director of the Global Disinformation Lab at UT Austin, and his research includes non-Western political warfare, the weaponization of information, and cognitive hacking, and the history of Soviet and East European intelligence services. Last but not least, we have Olga Belogolova, who's the director of the Emerging Technology Initiatives at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies at SAIS, where she's also a professor teaching a course on disinformation and influence in the digital age. She previously led policy to counter influence operations at Meta, specializing in coordinated inauthentic behavior, state media capture, and hack and leaks within the trust and safety team. She has a background in journalism and threat intelligence, and her work has been featured in publications like the Atlantic Council and the Globe and Mail. And these are the short versions of their bios. So the way the panel will go is we'll start with 5 minutes of opening remarks from each of the panelists. We'll then have a discussion before turning to the audience for Q&A. So to start us off, I'll turn it over to Renée.
Good morning. It's great to be here, and I'm excited to be talking about this topic. So I was trying to think about all of the many things to say about this. At Stanford Internet Observatory, we got researcher access to GPT-3 back in 2020. We went back in time, 2020, round numbers. And so we started writing a little bit about how it was going to transform propaganda, because it became clear quite quickly that it was phenomenal, actually, at generating both long-form and short-form propaganda. So I'm going to actually give a quick framework on three interlocking sets of trends using propaganda as the anchor. So if you think about a propaganda campaign, you have to create the content, then you have to disseminate the content, and then people have to either believe the content in the olden days or be distracted by the content in the modern era. And so I want to talk about three trends that are intersecting, that are influencing each of these three phases, let's call them. So in the context of creation, generative AI took the cost of creation to zero for video, for audio, for images, and for text. And what that meant was that there was a vastly expanded capacity for many different types of actors to use these tools to create content in ways that were both much more targeted to particular audiences, by which I mean you can create highly specific in-group language content that is very that is very focused on the community that is intended to receive it. So some of the ways that we used to see Russian, Chinese, and Iranian influence actors operating, it was through the creation of largely journalistic style content. There were often a lot of tells the language wasn't quite there, the slang was often off. Now with generative AI, that's completely transformed. With generative audio in particular, you can create very, very plausible mimicry of somebody's voice. With images, you can create sensational content. And the other thing that's really begun to happen also is that you can dismiss the real. So you have both the capacity to create unreality and the capacity to dismiss actual reality. So let's consider that our trends in creation. Then this intersects with trends in dissemination, because you can create content, but if nobody sees it, it doesn't matter. So the social media ecosystem, which intersects with the broadcast media ecosystem, both provide opportunities for disseminating content. Again, what we're seeing in social media is a series of very significant changes, even just since 2020. So we have a proliferation of social platforms. Many of the social platforms are very clearly oriented, particularly within the US, to people who are of a particular political or identity persuasion. So we saw a rise of right-leaning platforms, Truth Social, Parler, Gab, and then now, since particularly Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, we see a rise of left-leaning communities that have migrated to other platforms, like Blue Sky, like Mastodon, like Threads. And so you have a fragmentation of the audience as well. So you have more platforms, and then many of those platforms have they don't have fantastic teams like the one Olga used to run at Facebook. So they're understaffed, under-resourced. They simply don't have the capacity to do detection, even if they wanted to. And so you have both better, more high-quality creation, more platforms to blast it out on, more people moving into identity-entrenched bubbles on those platforms, and less capacity for detection, both from the technological standpoint, meaning it's harder to tell if the content is real or fake, and from the standpoint of resourcing of the teams themselves. And then the final trend is the belief and acceptance, right? The final phase of a campaign. And so if we think of things in terms of belief and acceptance, then the question becomes, are you more likely to be receptive to this kind of content? And actually, some of the research that Josh has done has shown that does seem to be the case, right? The material produced is potentially far more persuasive. But more than that, we're operating in an offline, if you will, situation in which there's very, very low trust in media. There's very low trust in fellow citizens. There's very low trust in institutions. So the same entities that would have, and in past epochs did, serve as counterpoints saying, no, this is foreign propaganda, no, this is fake, this is a hoax, are no longer trusted by half the population at any given time within the United States. And of course, that same kind of polarization and that same degree of distrust is manifesting in Western democracies elsewhere. One of the things that you do see in trust trend research and put out by places like Edelman and Pew is declines pretty much throughout all Western democracies without commensurate declines, interestingly, in authoritarian regimes and autocracies. So that's the sort of scenario that we find ourselves in. We have these three trends. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. And I think that's how we have to be thinking about and framing this conversation going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Renée, because and I'm also very happy to be here. And I would like to thank actually the previous panelists.
Oh, no, it is.
It is. For the technical introduction, because I will try today to be a little bit of devil's advocate, Texas, right? And try to argue for the fact that in our conversations about computational propaganda, about behavioral changes, and about the capacities and the affordances of generative AI, I think that our fears might be, just with any other new technology, a little bit overblown. And be part of those cyclical moral panics that usually accompany the implementation of each new model. However, that does not negate the fact that I also would like to highlight 4 potential avenues that we would like to think about the effects of the adoption of this tool, which is wonderful, which allows for many uses, and I'll try to argue that actually, some of the potential benefits the first panel already started talking about outweigh the risks. However, Renée, I agree with you that starting from the starting point in our conversation, we always have to think about the existence of our evolutionary heuristics that are tested constantly against ever-improving quantity, structure, and volume. So, the first big challenge is that it is, LLMs, especially if they're used by state and non-state actors in campaigns for creating malicious content, financial fraud, all the way to extortion. Those are the old same heuristics that we have to use with our brains, right, to discern. And when we are witnessing the first effect, which Renée was talking about, bringing the cost practically to zero, which brings us to the effect of flooding the zone, that's bad news for everyone, right? That's literally increasing the noise, and the signal, might get lost. Now, the signal, which is the second part of the second avenue that I was also trying to highlight, is that we are having highly fractured, at least in democratic societies, audiences, that basically hear their own signal, as you've described it, Renée, in different platforms. And all of them, this fragmentation lowers even further the bar, for checking what kind of signal is sent. Now, that brings me to the third avenue. This is great news for, people that are looking to equalize the field. I was fascinated, when I was looking at potential misuses and what the conversation in the security field, especially, is national security of generative models and, in adversarial situations. And our Israeli colleagues, have shown us that in one afternoon, they can help me out, improve my code writing in order to have, better spear phishing campaign, that can improve my language, can improve the ways that I'm thinking about approaching certain influence campaigns, and can suggest additional ideas that I might not have thought of. Now, that's great news, because it's a lower cost. At the same token, when we talk about national security, however, the wonders, that are provided by the tools are great news for, let's say, intelligence analysts. In their daily work, it's great to have instruments that will help you parse out in a number of, the noise that I was talking about. And especially when we're talking about range of accuracy in terms of error, then it is really helpful, to have the man-machine teaming. But of course, never forget that we need to have human in the loop. I wouldn't trust, a model like this, to work on very specific situations where the human should be the one that makes the ultimate decision. However, it's a brave new world out there, and we have to adapt, definitely not panic, but gradually, I think, to get used to the idea that, influence campaigns will be transformed one way or another, and that will, open a whole new questions for Olga.
Just for me?
Just for you.
So one thing I wanted to talk about before we get started is I went, into the Google machine, and I searched for news stories or articles within the last few days using the words elections and AI. And I wanted to read you a couple of the headlines. The big election year, how to stop AI from undermining the vote in 2024. Open season for AI to impact the 2024 election. AI threats to the 24 election, the lessons we can learn. Elections and the disinformation age are colliding like never before in 2024. Other words and terms that have been used with describing what AI will do to civil society and democracy have been things like Armageddon and a whole bunch of other sort of bombastic terms. And it's important. The reason we're having this conversation, this panel in the first place, is that we are acknowledging the importance of studying these problems, right? There's a whole conference here today just about generative AI to try to better understand it. It's important to understand the technology, the tools, and the potential sort of environment that those tools are in. But it's also important, not to overblow the threat, but not just because, we're trying to not overstate it, but particularly because one of the things that I've studied and other researchers in the space have studied is the intentions of various threat actors. Now, we can't always understand what it is that they are intending to do, because unless we have sort of gone into their troll farms and actually talked to some of them, and in some cases news reporters have, you don't always know what their aims are. Sometimes their aims are to tell their bosses that they did a really good job, like everybody else has. But sometimes, what you can learn from studying Soviet active measures and the history of influence operations is that, in particular, Russian threat actors, and perhaps some others, are sometimes less interested in a particular narrative rather than getting people to trust nothing at all. And if you think about that concept and then you place it next to artificial intelligence and the threats that it might bring to our society, one of the things that I'm particularly concerned about is the sort of second order effects of our conversations about this. Because ultimately, this distrust in institutions, right? If you're trying to address sort of the fundamental issues in society that make people vulnerable to believing false information or false personas or any kind of manipulation in the first place, it's that distrust that Renée was describing. And so are we sort of further eroding that distrust by having, this kind of fear-mongering conversation around these threats? I will also just plug for a paper that Josh just wrote recently. I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit during our conversation, is the concept of the liar's dividend. And this idea that there's, if we're talking about second and third order effects of the conversation about artificial intelligence and manipulation, you also have to think about the people that will use that inherent distrust to then say, well, you can't trust anything that's come out. This terrible, imagine the Access Hollywood tapes come out today. What is the next step of a politician after that, right? It's usually to dismiss what is harmful to their campaign. And so you get into a situation where, people are sort of using the threat as a way to further erode trust in institutions, trust in elections. And you can sort of see the trend lines, right? If we look at the early stages of this sort of modern era of the disinformation conversation, which really in the United States probably starts after the 2016 election, right? First, we're talking about what we've seen troll farms do. There's memes like Jesus wrestling Hillary Clinton, and that is then plastered on the cover of the New York Times, even though that meme itself only had 9 people like it. And so we're, sort of saying, okay, well, these kids that worked at this troll farm in St. Petersburg had such a massive impact. Now, let's actually talk about impact for a second. The impact that sort of I see, that sort of, researchers that are studying the space see, is that eroding distrust in society, not necessarily a particular outcome that anyone has been able to determine, right? Since the 2016 election, those studying what the troll farms, particularly Russian troll farms, had done, there's been one study on its impact on voter behavior. It's really hard to study these things. Renée can certainly tell you that, right? You can study the number of likes, the number of followers a page has had, but in and of itself, that doesn't necessarily tell us whether it's had an impact, right? So if we're talking about those trend lines, let's now fast forward to 2018. The 2018 midterms was the next time sort of technology companies and broader society was sort of tested for what we learned in 2016. And what happens in 2018 is threat actors like the Internet Research Agency, which I was tracking at the time, do something where it looks like they want to be caught, right? They have a website that's called usaira.ru. Not hiding who's behind that website, right? But even more so, if you're using investigative techniques, I'm going to look into the domain registration of this website. And then you do, and it's registered to Azimuth LLC, which is one of the 13 indicted organizations associated with the special counsel's investigation. So, they're not hiding their domain registration information, which, by the way, is not that hard to do these days. And then, on top of that, and this is sort of a lesser-known story, there's this video that is very briefly on YouTube where there's a guy who is known as a sort of character in the 2016 election. He releases a video where he says that I've quit the troll farm and here's how we interfered. You sort of see a lot of that conversation continue through 2020 with Yevgeny Prigozhin, claiming a whole bunch of headlines and saying, here's how good we are at our jobs. This is what we're doing. So you can sort of start to see that, and then you get into sort of the aftermath of 2020. And in the United States in particular, we're looking at people that no longer trust the outcome of the election. Is that entirely the fault of, foreign interference threat actors, or is that something that we've done to ourselves? That's a question that we can discuss.
Great. Thank you. There's a ton to unpack there. And I think before we dive into AI, I'd like to take a step back and pick up on the point that you made about intentions. And you both have studied influence operations in historical perspective. I was hoping that you can give a little bit of a background of what do different threat actors intend to do? To what extent do the aims today seem similar or different from the past? I know in your work you've talked about the weaponization of meta-narratives. So I thought maybe you could start, then go to Olga, and then I'll ask Renée to give a little bit more on the means, the different tools that states have today.
Well, thank you very much. Well, first of all, Olga, thank you for putting this recent canvas. And if we superimpose it on the larger sort of historical pattern, if we believe that there is such thing as organizational and cultural DNA that's been passed, so the late Prigozhin will not be a good example for it, but the traditions that exist within, the non-Western world, in this case, I'm thinking Russia, in terms of warfare, of course, open the whole conversation about активные мероприятия or active measures, which, in all of their varieties. So what are those, Well, basically, we are talking about the potential to disrupt and the ability, of diversion of a democratic process or a political process and skewing, hopefully, if we believe into reflex control theory and so on, to control certain outcomes that are desired. That, of course, ranges from anywhere from gathering compromats, creating, spreading false content, character killing, all the way to physical elimination, right? And so if we discard the physical elimination, although Mr. Prigozhin, could not escape, that, if that tells you something about the internal politics as we speak of, under Putin's regime, I would argue, Josh, that we are looking at, and I know it's a cliche, but it's old wine in new bottles, right? What we're looking at is ever-improving instrumentation, wider reach, supposedly, in terms of numbers and in terms of volume that could be pushed out. But the ideas, at least to my understanding, are not very different than from, what you can find described, by the old school KGB officers, in terms of what Olga was pointing out, something very important, and that is exploiting the existing processes, which are connected to mainly the diminishing of trust and erosion of trust, spreading, alternative reality. And I'll give you an example. On the way here, from Texas, I'd probably been asked at least by two people, which were really, really bothered. They were panicked. How are you guys doing down there? Will you be, are you holding up the line? You're overrun. It's like, I don't know. Yeah, I guess. And the reason being is that there is this alternative reality, which is, magnified, especially people that are outside of this country, reaping that benefit. And people, wholeheartedly are saying, well, that's what we hear, in non-English speaking press, such a huge border crisis and so on. If you talk to fellow Texans, as I see here in the audience, that would be very probably far from reality. However, as we know, it's, the idea of self-fulfilling sort of prophecies, fuels all this behavior. What I believe is more problematic as we are enlisting AI within this process, or generative AI in terms of content, images, sounds, or help us, with propagation of certain instruments, is the overall damage that we all participate in, co-creating in diminishing further the trust in institutions, the way we interact in our societies. And I think Renée mentioned something really important here, which really caught my attention. The difference, if we believe the polls, of what the effect is in democratic versus non-democratic regimes. Going back to my example with, people being very concerned, calling me, how do we cope in Texas? So short answer, yes. We think the mechanics is similar. The instrumentation is brand new.
Okay. So we were asked to talk about intentions of threat actors. And so I think it's also important to ask the intentions of whom in particular. And, myself and Kiril, have studied Russian threat actors throughout history. And that's, part of the question. But I think we can't just talk about Russia. We can talk about, I agree with Kiril's comments a little bit in terms of what we see. If you take one of the assignments I have for my students is to read a declassified Senate intelligence report from the 1980s, where they have this beautiful graphic and they show what they've studied about Soviet active measures during the Cold War. And you can take some of the specific sort of categorizations they have and map them precisely to the kinds of things we've seen Russian threat actors do today. So that includes things like covert and overt active measures, things that involve state-controlled media outlets, but also involve some sort of covert measures that include dissemination of information or amplification of existing narratives and stories, and sort of fissures in society, and then using agents of influence, so reaching and connecting with individuals and trying to get them to disseminate your message for you. So you can draw some parallels between what you can see in what the U.S. intelligence community has studied about Soviet active measures and then what we see today. But aside from Russian threat actors, we can also talk about the distinctions between them and Chinese and Iranian and other sort of major threat actors that you might think of when it comes to the information environment. And they're different, right? Because each sort of state has its own objectives and also structures of how it actually has done this throughout history and to this day. And so if you can make some comparisons, then some things have changed over the last maybe 5-10 years, but in particular, Chinese and Iranian threat actors tend to show their hand a lot more in their operations than Russian actors do, in the sense that they are often, that their narratives tend to align more with state objectives. Now, again, the questions about intent, it's really hard to determine what is the specific intent of each respective threat actor. As I mentioned in my remarks earlier, one of those intentions can sometimes be to show their bosses they're doing a good job. Sometimes the individuals who are employed by troll farms or by Russian military intelligence or others have certain quotas of things that they need to post and do per day. Sometimes the intelligence agencies are competing against one another, so they want to sort of show that they've done a better job than the other intelligence agency. So those are some of the things that they do, and oftentimes, with the Russian threat actors, it's to sort of exploit the fissures in society, and with the other threat actors from different countries, sometimes it's just to make sure that their state objectives are entered into the information environment. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention, we're talking about generative AI, we're talking about artificial intelligence. We have to make a distinction between what we're seeing from foreign interference and foreign threat actors, but also just the average person using these techniques, political campaigns, and domestic threat actors. When I worked at Meta, we saw this rising trend in our investigations. The more we looked for foreign influence campaigns, the more we found domestic campaigns in different countries around the world, right? That trend line kept going up and up the entire time I worked there. And that's not just in the United States, right? You see a lot of authoritarian governments, rising liberalism in different places around the world. And so hand in hand with that, you see a lot of governments and political parties that are using influence to try to deceive people. And they aren't necessarily going to be some big, bad foreign threat actor. And then aside from all of that, there are the misinformed individuals, right? One of my biggest sticking points whenever I talk about these issues is to make sure that we actually agree on what we're talking about. Every conference that you go to on the subject, people sit around and, my colleagues on the stage will probably agree, and everyone says, okay, let's talk about definitions. And, it's been 7 years and we're still doing it. And we're still sitting around the table and saying, okay, but what do you mean when you say this, right? And then people invent new words to mean some of the same things that they've heard before. In fact, one of my favorite fun facts is that the term propaganda, which many of you may know, it carries certain connotations with it, but it actually is a relatively neutral term by its definition. It just means, the promotion of a narrative on behalf of a state or another organization that is supportive of that organization. The U.S. State Department in the 1970s invented the term public diplomacy because we didn't want to use the term propaganda anymore, because propaganda meant, big bad things, right? But to them. And so I think it's important that sort of the meanings of words matter, because a lot of what we might be concerned about from a domestic and national security perspective when it comes to artificial intelligence and influence operations are people who are using these tools and then becoming misinformed, not knowing whether what they've received from the tool is actually accurate, including some of my students who may write papers with inaccurate information in it because the AI hallucinated, right? So we have to think about all of the different people involved when we're thinking about the information environment. And last but not least, I'll also say, we're talking about the robocall. And for those of you that don't know, there's basically what is believed to be a sort of deep fake or cheap fake of President Biden's voice that was disseminated via telephone, right? And so we're talking about dissemination platforms. One of the ones that we haven't talked about is a phone. And what are sort of the measures that we can use to protect in that space? Because, a lot of us have spent a lot of time talking about technology platforms. What do we do to protect sort of the broader information environment, including our phones?
So I pose to you to share a little bit about the means. What channels do states have? I also know that we're talking about AI today, and I want to make sure we get that in. So as you describe the different channels that states have for waging propaganda campaigns, can you integrate where you think generative AI tools will make a bigger difference, or where channels are likely to really stay the same?
Sure. So I want to clarify that one of the things, and you referenced moral panic, my opening comments were purely descriptive. This is what has happened. This is what is happening. Moral panic implies that I also think that it is somehow bad. I think that it is actually completely irrelevant whether or not I think it is good or bad, because it has happened. And so since we're thinking about this from a national security standpoint, we have to be very clear-eyed about capacity. And so what I'm talking about is basic capacity. So propaganda fide. So Pope Gregory decides, after the advent of the printing press and the Martin Luther, the rise of Protestantism, and this spread, as the influence of the pamphlets begins to shape opinions about the Catholic Church in far-flung lands, the purpose of propaganda fide, and propaganda is the gerundio form of the verb, it implies an imperative. You must go and propagate the faith. This is a matter of the continuity of the church depends on you propagating the message. So when we talk about aims and when we connect it to means, you see the objective of the actor is either to persuade someone, right? To persuade them that in this particular case, you have to bring them back to the one true faith. You have to redefine for them what reality is now that these Protestants have started saying all of these things. But what's very interesting about it is, what are the means at his disposal? Well, he sends the cardinals out because it's word of mouth at the time. And so the earliest form of persuasion is that word of mouth. And I want you to just remember that for a second. Because what starts to happen is then you have the age of technological and broadcast media. You have several different technological revolutions. You have radio, then you have television. And so you go from one-to-one, that sort of very personal persuasion, to a mass broadcast. And that changes propaganda. All of a sudden, you do start to see state actors participating in influence operations in the covert sense. So let's think about a 2x2. Let's make a little 2x2. We have the broadcast environment through the series of technological revolutions that turns speech from one-to-one or one to a small group to one to the masses. And what starts to happen there is your power of communication is increasing. You don't really know what the impact is, but you know that you have the potential to reach far more people. And so that starts to happen both in overt capacities, right? You see the rise of things like Voice of America or BBC or a number of different overt, transparent state media outlets. And most of the great powers actually do work to develop that overt propaganda capacity because they want to get their official message out there. They're propagating the faith, right? And then on the flip side, there's also the recognition that the most persuasive form of communication is the one that comes from your friend or the one that comes from someone like you. And that's why the rise of covert propaganda actually is to create that bond of trust, that bond of common identity. And so the entire point of so-called black propaganda is to make the message more resonant because it looks like it's coming from you. And that's why what you start to see is the great powers begin to invest in propaganda apparatuses that are either run by front organizations, funded by front money, or they place, as Olga references, agents of influence or fake journalists, or, China does it a bunch of different ways, in the target environment of the population that they're trying to reach. So that's broadcast, and we have overt and covert. And then social comes into the picture. And now we're actually back to that one-to-one communication where I can communicate with anybody I want to anywhere in the world, but I also now have the power to broadcast. So you have a fundamental shift where I am not an instrument of the state, contrary to rumors on the internet. And what you see is that dynamic in which I can say something persuasively to you because I look just like you. I am somebody who is of your community, of your identity. And so what you start to see is the social media environment is also co-opted by state actors, both overtly, right? Some of the largest pages on Facebook, many of the audience is actually inauthentic, but it's there, is actually Chinese state media, right? And it is the state media pages that achieve literally hundreds of millions of followers as overt mouthpieces for the state manifested on social media platforms. They block it within their own country, but they use American technological infrastructure and dissemination and ad targeting and reach to reach the other populations all around the world that would not necessarily be listening to their radio stations or watching their television channels. So now you have overt propaganda on social media. You also have the wolf warriors for China. They're actually remarkably effective brawlers. They communicate like Twitter trolls. They dunk on their enemies and they get retweets. Again, sometimes inauthentic, but often authentic. And so what you start to see is that overt social component blending with, it's additive, it's not replacing, it's just now more of a capacity that they have in order to achieve their objectives, which is to get their message out. And then similarly, of course, you have the covert social quadrant. And I think that one of the problems with a lot of the research in the field, particularly since 2016, is that a lot of it over-focused on the social covert component. And so we talk about influence operations as if the Russian troll farm was, for example, the only thing that happened in 2016, when it is not. It is actually the Russian military capacity to go and hack the Clinton campaign and the DNC and to put that content out through broadcast channels, including American broadcast channels, where that degree of trust is there. And so that's when you look at, you have to think about this, I would argue, in the context of a full spectrum influence operation. You have broadcast and social, overt and covert, and good actors are using all four quadrants simultaneously. Josh and I actually write about this. And then to layer in AI, again, you're changing the playing field just enough where you have that capacity to make content that is targeted to the audience, that speaks as if it is a member of the community, that speaks as if it's part of the audience, that is also either highly persuasive or can be blasted out en masse to distract rather than persuade. And then again, the mere existence of it allows for the denial of reality, which is what we saw, for example, in the early days of the Russia-Ukraine conflict or the Israel-Gaza conflict. And so that is the dynamic, I would argue. If you think about the capacity spectrum, you have to be looking across how a well-resourced actor uses all of these things simultaneously. And this is not a call to regulate AI or social media. It is simply a statement that this is the landscape upon which these operations play out. And so the continued objective and means and desire to propagate a narrative happens across the spectrum rather than within one.
One thing that I thought of when Renee was just talking, when we were talking about sort of the 2016 environment, in addition to sort of Russian military intelligence and broadcast media as part of that ecosystem, the other thing I failed to mention earlier was the financially motivated actors as well, particularly in 2016, but onwards, people that make money off of clickbait, whose intention is to use content to just make money, right? Because someone is going to click on it because it's really flashy. And I think it's important to sort of add that to the conversation, because when I think about the use of artificial intelligence, when I think about who would benefit most from it, I tend to gravitate more towards the financially motivated because they've always benefited from scale and ability to produce content. So I think I just wanted to add that little piece.
Oh, thank you very much. Renée, certainly I was not implying that and connected to World Panics. I just wanted to illustrate that historically, and thank you for going us, back to the propagation of the congregation of fate. But there's something important that you mentioned, and it is the ethics. And I hope that there'll be a lot of conversations around the ethics. And I think Olga just pointed out something important to that matter, when she talked about financial. So I absolutely agree with what you're saying about the resourcing in the quadrant. As a social scientist, immediately I'm like, oh, yeah, it's 2 by 2. So what I'm really sort of fascinated by is to what degree, because that in the scholarly conversation, in the discourse, always there is the critique, right, about, how do we measure, the impact into actual behavior, right? So because we look at perception, cognition, and then, behavioral modification, then it becomes blurred, right? Because you'd always be, asking, well, and hence some of the most resilient sort of beliefs that say there was no Russian interference, or there is, show me the proof. And I think that both of you illustrated that something which is important to me, where I think AI might make actually a measurable change, it is the shift of the meta-narratives, which and the ability to be controlled. And I think the Chinese example is a very good one, and I think partially, the case of Iran and so on. So at meta level, this is where I think we'll see a large difference because of, the economies of scale, because of simply the improvement of the input. Whether that will translate into immediate effects, I would rather think that those will be diffused, just as what we've seen before, and probably more pronounced for certain demographics. Now, speaking of the really, I think bad sort of side of, I'm going to use also a kindergarten, where the really bad side of AI, actually, when it comes to mind, is something that the previous panel was talking about, and this is the inbuilt biases, and most importantly, the malicious use for financial gain, for blackmail, because you mentioned our phones, but I was thinking immediately, like my, kindergarten bad brain was thinking, oh, okay, well, what about, the cases, very rare, but still existing when, you're assisted, in asking ransom or trying to do, things which are really, really on the bad side of spectrum. Now, this is where I think the covert side, especially when we look from national security, because those are purely criminal acts, and I'm more concerned, like for the wider audience, is whether the AI or the LLM will be hallucinating health-related data, or whether it will produce misleading, data or slightly altered, that will worsen the situation of everyone else. But those extreme cases need to be thought about. They certainly become the domain of national security, law enforcement, and definitely intelligence. When we're talking about accuracy, when we're talking about early warning, after all, this would be the sort of, and, social listening, academia, and civil society, equally has a stake in it. Because, as you said, today is your phone, tomorrow might be my health records. The day after might be alteration that, God forbid, if it's connected to critical infrastructure or, some other serious things which are really, really bad on the spectrum.
I want to give Renée just a quick second to talk about how you've been tracking AI being used for spams and scams, and then I have a few other questions to you.
It's one of these funny things. I hope we have it out soon. There's this, I don't know, how many people here have used Midjourney, made an image using something like Midjourney? Okay, handful. It has a very particular distinct house style, right? Produces a very particular type of output. We kind of joke around about it being like the Thomas Kincaid of image generation, just this like lowbrow. Anyway, But what is insane about it is that spammers have realized and that Facebook's algorithms will actually promote content that involves these images. And one of the reasons that this is happening is because people will engage with it, particularly a couple months back when it became very popular and appeared all over the internet. You started to see people engaging with the images. Wow, this is so cool. Wow, this is amazing. And then, of course, as Olga notes, financial scams become one of the defaults. So one of the things that we've been seeing is actually proliferation of pages that are very reminiscent of the old Macedonian teenagers of 2016. So the story of the Macedonian teenagers is back in 2015, 2016, Facebook has this trending topics feature. And they realized that if they can produce fake news, the original meaning of the term, actually demonstrably fake stories that are very sensational, tabloid type stuff, people will go and click on it, then they will land on their website, and then they will earn money from the monetized ad page. So this becomes a whole thing. And actually the origin of fake news is not the Russian troll factory at all. Actually, it is the Macedonian teenagers and their content farms. So one of the things that we're seeing is actually these pages that are being run out of Armenia now, where they use AI images as the lead gen to draw people in. They're constantly soliciting comments from the audiences. They get a lot of comments, and then the content gets pushed out to more people. And as Facebook has made decisions, there's no longer a trending topics list, but as content is curated less by what you follow and more by what you engage with in sort of a TikTok-style recommendation model of you engaged with this thing, so you probably like more of this thing, but rather than suggesting you follow the page, we're just going to show you more of the content. What we're seeing is this content that is being used for that lead gen, and sure enough, the first comment under the AI-generated image is the actual page that they want you to visit. And interestingly, those pages, those domains are also AI-generated. So they use AI, they generate the content farm. You don't even have to employ your shitty writers anymore. You just have the AI generate everything from start to finish, from the text to the outputs. And so this is a dynamic where we're seeing actually in some cases hundreds of millions of engagements on certain phrases and certain topics related to this model. And so it is very much the spammers that are kind of at the vanguard, but then some of these pages are clearly doing it for audience growth. And then you do see the pages changing hands and changing names. And so it's extremely reminiscent of that same dynamic. And it's just another example of using the newest, most novel capacity and technology to achieve the objective, which is, in this case, to profit.
So I'm going to put two questions to the group, and maybe you can each choose one. The first is on personalization. There's a lot of concern that AI tools can be used to personalize propaganda to specific targets based either on their demographic information, on information pulled from their social media pages. To what extent do you think the personalization concern is significant versus maybe people aren't that persuadable to begin with? So how do you think about personalization? The second is multiple different comments have highlighted messaging and how it may be difficult to educate about the risks of deepfakes without undermining trust in real content. So how would you recommend policymakers, thought leaders, news media talk about the risks of AI without undermining trust in real information? Does anybody want to start with either personalization or messaging?
I could probably start with the messaging to lead the hard part. From like, oh, that was not very gentlemanly. Sorry. Thank you for the wonderful remarks. Because they got me thinking. We started, with this, provocation in our panel, to think whether, the fears of misuse of generative AI and trust, LLM models, are they out of proportion, overblown? And, I've started, with kind of poking, about the cyclical moral panics in Western societies. However, I really do feel for policymakers, and especially our colleagues in the security sector, in the shoes and the gatekeepers, for a very particular reason. And this is the overall situation surrounding and the condition of social trust and interpersonal trust. I think, again, there was a reason why I said I'm glad that we're here at Catholic, and the question of ethics is really fundamental, because technologically, I think we're, those are not futuristic models anymore. However, if you listen carefully to what my colleagues were talking about from their experience, with samples of the data or controlling the process within the organization, my humble experience of looking at different samples, that have implications for also national security, some of it is scary stuff, right? It does not help, Josh, to talk about it in apocalyptical terms to describe it. I think Olga's here, with the headlines, it was just significant, right? I mean, there will be tomorrow. However, we have to be very careful to think through, those big incoming shifts, and I think that they are already happening. There is a reason why I think we're in agreement here that unfortunately, the scammers of this world happen to be, and the crooks, usually are at the vanguard, for financial profit or any other purposes. And then either they mimic some of the, tactics for the things that they have in mind, or, do it on a smaller scale than, let's say, well-resourced state actor, which has much more strategic objectives than the guys in Macedonia, to make a quick euro or dollar. But in terms of messaging, every great opportunity comes at a cost. And I think it's a historical fact that's always been. It just made me thinking, from the invention of the printing press all the way, through, industrial revolution and, social media platform revolution, it transforms. And I think we live in unprecedented times in the sense that the way the mode of production actually is being transformed. And that brings a lot of anxiety, a huge social anxiety, in the Western world, and is being manifested in multiple ways. Unfortunately, one of the manifestations is a very low trust in institutions. And when I talk about institutions, I always, tend to remind myself and my students, right, is one of the best definitions is the good old Bergie Nord's definition, those set of rules, social conventions that we have agreed upon. It seemed to me that we're, at a territory where all of those are disputed, right? We cannot agree fundamentally, about facts, which should be, kind of the objective foundation of empirical science. And therefore, we have a really hard time, in terms of persuading the public, and let alone politicians, because, they are coming from political parties, part of society. The other part, literally is dismissing, anything that has been said. So it's an alternative reality. So having in mind all of the beautiful transformative power in terms of efficiency, be it on the checkout lines for the airport, or, people that are looking at stem cells, and, or, battling cancer, a number of things. This is beautiful, this will help, but there is a huge danger, which it will breed also, unfortunately, inequalities within our society to begin with, but also globally. We didn't have a chance to talk to them. I hope later on somebody will pick up that topic, that after all, we are talking about, the better, part, the better living part of this planet. We still are to see what effects that will have in countries, which will adopt it, or societies that might not have necessarily the ethical problems that we're debating here, in order to achieve whatever their elites have in mind. So that, is just this huge disbalance that needs to be addressed, for different parts of our society, definitely not in panicky terms, no apocalyptic, but also realistic, because setting up the realistic expectations, I think John Askinos was really great about this. The dust, needs to be explained, in a comprehensible terms.
Olga, do you want to either take on messaging or personalization?
I'll do both really quickly. So with the personalization, I think, what Renée was talking about earlier is really important to highlight, which is the fact that, human beings tend to, trust someone who is speaking directly to them, knows something about them. And that's a reason why that personalization problem is something that people are concerned about. I think one thing I'll say about the way these things are investigated which will hopefully help on a threat intelligence team inside of a technology company, is looking specifically at the deceptive behaviors of someone rather than the content that they're sharing, which can be helpful sometimes. Again, that was the thing that we always drilled down. The policy that I managed was called coordinated inauthentic behavior, not information for a reason. And, I think what gives me some comfort is, looking at the way I would, run an investigation based on, sort of the changing techniques and tools that we might see. And I don't know that investigation would be in some negative way impacted by the fact that someone has personalized messaging. So I think that brings me some comfort. And I also, my old team, the most recent report they put out, the threat report, the quarterly threat reports that they put out on what their findings were, they did, talk about what they've seen when it comes to generative AI in that last report. And there were some interesting, definitely point you guys to that report, highlights that they talked about. And they drew, I think 2019 was the first time they'd seen generative images in a campaign from something that originated from Vietnam in the United States. And then I think there was a couple examples in other years, and they talked about how they investigated those operations. And sometimes the actual use of generative techniques was able to help them find those operations in the first place. So that brings me some comfort. When it comes to the messaging, one of the things, we're talking about sort of apocalypse and Armageddon and all that other stuff. One thing that I heard recently, which I looked up and to confirm that it was true, which is an important thing to do, no matter, in our problems to, address this issue, was when Photoshop was first released in 1988. There are a lot of people who were saying a lot of the same things about Photoshop that they are today about, generative AI. And it's interesting to sort of go and look back at some of those stories from that time period. And then we sort of fast forward when we think about, how have we actually dealt with Photoshop? Because the stories, again, were very much, we won't be able to trust images ever again, right? And in some ways, that was probably right. And, people are more skeptical of images they consume. To add a little sort of humor to the conversation, how many of you guys, by show of hands, have heard of the hurricane shark? Obviously, yeah. So for those of you that don't know, the hurricane shark is basically a National Geographic image of someone, I think, in a kayak over this beautiful sea of water, very clear water, and you could see sort of the shark behind them. And that was a photo that was then taken, and in pretty much every time there was a natural disaster, some kind of flooding happening, that hurricane shark ended up in the waters of whatever city was being flooded, right? And then the story would disseminate, and people would say, oh my God, there's a shark going down the road in Houston, what are we gonna do? And so this became, but that was a use of Photoshop, right? Someone took this beautiful clear water, photoshopped the shark out of it, and then put it in, every single other image. It created some panic, but ultimately, I think, when you, again, maybe I'm too much of an optimist for being someone who was born in the Soviet Union, but I think, I look at sort of the trajectory of how we dealt with that problem as a society, and similar problems to it, and we've sort of learned over time how to sort of trust but verify. Not everyone has, and I think that that's something that, when I think about messaging, when I think about dealing with this problem, it's about, saying what has been found, being very clear about what it is and what it isn't. That's what a good investigator does. That's one of the reasons why Bellingcat investigations are so popular, is because they walk you through every single part of their investigation. They tell you what they found, and they also tell you when it wasn't super successful, when they didn't know who was behind it, and all these other things. And they make fun of the baddies, so to speak, when they're not good at their jobs. And that's the other thing that, humor, there's been some research about using humor in messaging. And sometimes, I remember one of the, if we fast forward from, the Internet Research Agency teenagers to, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there was the sort of Cyberfront Z, group of teenagers sitting on beanbags and working. I think when I remember the way we described that, and some of other researchers described that operation, we were talking about how bad they were at their jobs, right? And so sometimes, being able to say, okay, well, this operation was actually successful and these are the techniques that they use, but then differentiating it from the ones that are actually kind of bad at it can be helpful. And last but not least, I'll bring up also another example from the early days of the invasion of Ukraine, when there was what I would call a cheap fake or shallow fake of Zelensky, which I think is mentioned in some of the writing that you guys have done, where there's basically a video of him where his neck didn't quite align to his head, if you watch it. And, that's why I call it a cheap fake or a shallow fake. And, I believe he was saying that Ukraine was surrendering or something like that. And I think the way the Zelensky team dealt with that particular problem was, using both sort of their intelligence apparatus and their messaging. They found out that it was coming out. They were able to sort of have him shoot a video where he was not actually in the place where they said he was. And he did that multiple times throughout the early stages of the war. They did really good strategic communications to sort of like pre-bunk and debunk what they saw using that technology. Now, let's imagine that it was a little bit better than that, but that same idea holds, which is there's going to be Photoshop, there's going to be, bad cheap fakes, and there's going to be much better audio, video, and image content. But, I think where I stand is I think that as a society, the fundamental issues of rebuilding trust in institutions and also getting people to learn how to trust and verify information are always going to be relevant, from like the pamphlets in the early days of the printing press to today.
I want to make sure we get to questions from the audience. So if people have questions, please raise your hand. And while we're getting a mic to the first person with a question, can the panelists in just a sentence or two respond to where do you think generative AI tools are most promising for combating influence operations or disinformation? Is it in fact-checking, the threat investigation space? What sort of positive applications do you see here?
I'll just go really quick and say there's been some reports that have just come out recently from people that used to work at technology companies talking about content moderation and the uses of these tools for content moderation. So I recommend reading those. But just in a nutshell, the idea of being able to sort of scale what is really difficult to scale is what AI is good at. And so content moderation is I think, the best place.
Also, I'll build off from that, and filtering and content moderation, absolutely, and also summary of petabytes of mundane data that needs to be sifted through and synthesized, as a shorthand for a human analyst to pick up over from, as a stepping stone, in a sense that what I think is the most promising, in combating. When you are trying to, have this 360-degree, view that Olga is talking about, it really saves you a lot of, man hours, human input work that could be done, by the generative AI. That's where I think it's the most promising to begin with.
Yeah, I would just kind of plus one both of those. I think those are the two main areas. I would say that there's a lot of theory about AI detecting AI. There's also a long lag. And so right now that's not been particularly promising, in part because what you'll see is, I think 11 Labs was the AI tool that produced the Biden voice content that made the rounds. And I think that, if I recall what I read, it was something like their system returned that it was like 84% likely to have come from their tool. And so this question of, we saw this with Israel Gaza too, unfortunately. We saw images that were strategically blurred in certain pieces, certain parts, run through detection generators, and then it returned that they were in fact AI generated when they were not, because that pixelated blur threw off the detection algorithm. So I think that the two areas here make the most sense in the immediate term. And I would do one small plug for on Tech Policy Press, which is a really great blog for understanding where things are going with this. Stanford colleagues, just actually one of them who had headed trust and safety at OpenAI and another who'd been at Facebook, actually just wrote a long analysis of how content moderation could be transformed using there.
This is Samid and Dave Wilner.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I'm Kelsey Frierson. I'm a technology fellow in the Senate, and really appreciate this panel because I think this is kind of the top of mind issue going into the 2024 elections, not only here but around the world. Something that I've thought a lot about is if there are... Okay, there we go. Okay.
Gonna have to get another.
Okay, I'll talk loudly for right now. Okay. Something I've thought a lot about is if there is kind of like what potential solutions there are in the short term here. I think the kind of question that Josh just raised too about how tools can be used, like if there's some way to authenticate truthful information, like some sort of watermark capability to say like this is true and not created by AI. But also kind of looking at like solutions from tech companies. I know all the big social media firms have rolled out their kind of like approach to the election. I know the AI labs have taken their kind of policy approach. Is there anything in the political space that you think can be done before the 2024 election to kind of help this? There are several kind of initiatives in the Senate right now, and I know in the House as well. Would government intervening and saying, no, we're not going to use AI at all in the election, would that help or hurt the cause of like trustworthy technology use for the election?
They're on different programs. They're different recordings. Somebody want to take that question? Go for it.
There's a lot there. So, first, Dave Wilner, who was the colleague of mine who we mentioned that worked at OpenAI, we wrote a piece actually evaluating the Biden executive order on this front. Watermarking is a valuable thing that should happen. It is only going to happen and be enforceable with certain types of models. And a lot of what's coming out is through the open source model community. One of the things that is not necessarily appropriate to this panel, but that Stanford Internet Observatory does, is we look at child safety and non-consensual intimate imagery. And what we see overwhelmingly is that the generation of that content, which is manifestly illegal, is actually happening in large part through the open source model community. So in my opinion, Congress could actually start by looking there. And I think Lindsey Graham and Josh Hawley actually just announced a bill, perhaps with Senator Klobuchar, in the hearing that is happening literally concurrently in this moment. So get that one passed. The problem with watermarking, though, just to get back to the national security angle, is that there are going to be models that don't have it. And so even if you create something whereby Facebook, with the Mid-Journey Thomas Kincaid art, begins to tag it constantly with AI-generated, is that it creates an interesting dynamic around trust, because when you see an image that does not have that tag, you might be more inclined to believe it's real, when in fact it's actually just been pushed through a different type of model. So you create a different kind of manifestation around trust. The other problem that's happening, and we go very deeply into this in this post, is that there's also questions about image provenance, right? And this is the Photoshop question. And actually Adobe is kind of at the vanguard of this, which is to say, can you verify or sort of offer a trace, if you will, of the manifestational changes that an image has gone through? They call it from glass to glass, sort of from the moment a camera takes a picture through whatever Photoshop does to it to the moment that it's put out. Can you create almost like an audit log of those changes? And so the provenance work is also interesting, but then the questions then become like, what devices have that built in? Is everybody going to have access to those devices? What happens when you have a person taking atrocity photos, the photos of a real atrocity in a part of the world that may not have access to that kind of technology early on? Do you then again create the perception that, only things that have a provenance or that have a watermark are either identified as real or identified as fake, when you have this entire kind of intermediate period where that's not going to be deployed? So I think it's worthwhile to argue for watermarking. I think it's worthwhile for Congress and the executive branch to continue to do these things. But I don't think that this is not going to make any difference before the 2024 elections, if we're being candid here.
I'll just add really quickly, I think having spent a good portion of my career doing what you might call playing whack-a-mole, like taking down a whole bunch of baddies, it's very good and it feels good to take down false information or manipulated profiles and all this other stuff. But ultimately, it does feel like you're just sort of fighting against, like you're like Jon Snow and they've just come over the wall and there's, that sort of meme where he's there with the sword and, you don't really know if he's going to make it, right? So it kind of feels that way when you're on a threat intelligence team, no matter where you are, no matter how many people you hire. And so, I think one thing I've been thinking a lot about since I left working at tech platforms is spending more time sort of inserting good information into the information environment rather than just trying to remove the bad, finding ways to get good, but also compelling and catchy accurate information into the information environment. Like I follow, speaking on the national security side, I use this example a lot. I follow sort of the various military Instagram accounts, and I think the Navy account is actually quite good at sort of telling a good story, perhaps better than some of the other services. And, you know, I've talked to some former colleagues of mine who have worked at, you know, counter WMD and doing work in that space. And, you know, they have seen, you know, the U.S. government often puts out these like 40, 50-page reports to like verify that something is real. And then the Russian, you know, response is like, let's have a flashy press conference. And yeah, like, you know, the wolf warrior kind of, you know, response, right?
I think we have time for one more question. Do we have?
Yeah, thank you. I know there's a lot of talk about the bias in the data set, but you're not going to do too much about the bias in the audience. That seems to me AI is just a better tool at reinforcing the biases that we have and putting more factual information out there. It hasn't changed the opinion of 70 million people that the election was stolen, despite the court's findings. The tobacco industry, the pharmaceutical people, the anti-vaxxers, the merchants of doubt, as they're called. It doesn't take too much, to use a four-letter word, fake, to dismiss a PhD dissertation disproving something that somebody wants to believe. So what hope do we have of using AI against human nature?
Thank you, for putting me on the spot.
I talked a lot.
I was just looking for a sec. Thank you for this wonderful observation. I think it's a good way to finish this panel to illustrate the fact that technological potency and power does not mean that we will be able, we were suggesting existing ideas and techniques and trends, what we see. However, if you remember, at least in my remarks, I used the word ethics, a number of times. Those are ethical questions, and I believe the previous panel, one of the speakers, when she was talking about, the trade-offs, for efficiency versus fairness, there is a lot this community needs to think about, and I think Olga, started kind of like sketching out a little bit, like of stepping, from the daily battles of taking out threat actor baddies and thinking about philosophically, what and how technology, can be harnessed to ensure that there is a little bit, better harmony, a little bit more equality, a little bit more ethical approach. And you're absolutely right. Human nature is human nature. I think that, as I said, one of the biggest challenges in my mind, is that we do still have our evolutionary heuristics, right? And we're faced with ever increasing capacities, for those to be deceived, in essence. Not only that, but I think that as generative AI, allows us to, become more efficient, to have the potential use for very good, outcomes, it also, unfortunately, opens the door for the worst of us, just as with the shark, right, and, swimming on the streets of Houston. So it is, after all, a human-centered question, about who we are and why we're using it. Thank you.
Thank you to the panelists for a great conversation. We are now going to break for lunch, and I'm passing along the message that the salads at lunch are for those who are gluten-free, and I think that's it. So thank you very much. We can get a round of applause to the panel.